There are moments in war that don't make it into any official report. No citation, no commendation, no record in any file that you could pull from a cabinet in Washington, D.C., or read about in a declassified document 20 years from now. They happen in the dark, in the dirt, in the spaces between orders, and the only witnesses are the men who were there and the wind that carried the sound away. This is one of those moments. Kunar Province, Afghanistan, April 2009. The air smells like cordite and cold mountain stone, and the temperature has dropped 15 degrees since sundown. A firefight that started 40 minutes ago has burned itself down to something quieter. Not peace, but the particular stillness that follows violence when every man still standing is checking himself for holes he hasn't felt yet. In the middle of that stillness, a woman is kneeling on the ground. She is small, 5'3", maybe 118 pounds. Her uniform is torn at the left shoulder. There is blood on both her hands, not her blood, and she is working with the focused precision of someone who has done this 100 times before, pressing a trauma dressing against the femoral wound of a man twice her size, while simultaneously tracking the northeast corner of the building with the muzzle of a rifle she holds in her other hand. She is not shouting. She is not panicking. Her voice when she speaks is low and even, the kind of voice that cuts through noise because it doesn't try to compete with it. 3 operators stand nearby watching her. Big men, experienced men. Men who have been in worse situations than this and come out the other side with nothing but scars and silence. They are watching her the way men watch something they cannot immediately categorize, not with hostility, but with the particular suspension of judgment that comes when the evidence in front of you contradicts everything you assumed. Then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. A figure moves through the smoke. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Voss has been running special operations for 19 years. He has been saluted by senators. He has shaken hands with generals. He has sat in rooms where the decisions made would not be discussed for decades. He is not a man given to ceremony. He stops 3 feet from the woman kneeling in the dirt. He looks at her for a long moment. She does not look up. She is finishing the dressing, one hand maintaining pressure, the other holding the rifle level and steady at the doorway across the room. Then Garrett Voss straightens his spine to its full height, raises his right hand to the brim of his cover, and holds a salute, not at a flag, not at a rank, at her. He holds it for 8 seconds. The 3 operators don't move. Nobody makes a sound. That moment took 8 years to arrive. This is how it happened. Fayetteville, North Carolina sits in the flat middle of the state like a town that was built for one purpose and never tried to pretend otherwise. Fort Bragg is its heartbeat, its economy, its identity. You can feel the military in the air there, not as an abstraction, but as something physical. The rumble of helicopters at dawn, the way strangers at the grocery store stand a little straighter than people in other cities, the particular silence of a neighborhood when a unit has deployed and all the lights on one block go on at the same hours every morning because the spouses left behind are all running the same schedule, holding the same breath. Sloan Harker grew up in that silence. She was born in the winter of 1983, the only child of Daniel Harker and his wife Claire. Daniel was a quiet man with a wide smile and eyes the color of winter sky. The kind of man who could walk into any room and immediately identify every exit and every potential threat without appearing to look for either. He was Army, Special Forces, the kind of soldier whose service record had more blacked out lines than readable ones. He started teaching Sloan to shoot when she was 10 years old. Not because he was careless with her, because he was careful. Because he understood better than most what the world was capable of, and he believed that the greatest gift he could give his daughter was not protection, it was competence. They drove out to a field south of town every Saturday morning, just the 2 of them before the sun had fully cleared the tree line. He never rushed her. He never raised his voice. He corrected her grip, her stance, her breathing, her patience, especially her patience with the same steady attention he gave everything that mattered to him. The rifle was a Remington 700, bolt action, older than Sloan by nearly 2 decades. He had carried it on 2 deployments, modified the stock himself, added a scope he had paid for out of pocket because the issued equipment wasn't good enough for the standard he held himself to. On the underside of the stock, carved in letters small enough that you had to look for them, were 3 words: slow, steady, sure. He told her those words on the morning of her first lesson and repeated them every Saturday after that, not as a mantra, but as a diagnosis, a checklist for every moment when the instinct to rush overcomes the discipline to wait. She never forgot them. She never forgot him either. In October of 2001, when Sloan was 18 years old and 3 weeks into her first semester of college in Raleigh, a man in a uniform knocked on Claire Harker's door. He was followed by a chaplain. He held his cover in both hands and spoke in the careful, measured language that the Army uses when it has to reduce a man's life to a notification. Daniel Harker, killed in action, Tora Bora region, classified circumstances. They handed Claire a folded flag and a phone number for a casualty assistance officer. They did not tell her everything. They could not. Some of what they knew they weren't authorized to share. Some of what had happened they didn't fully understand themselves. And some of it, the part that mattered most, had been buried in a classified file that would sit untouched in a drawer at Langley for the next 8 years. Sloan drove home that same night. She sat with her mother at the kitchen table until 4 in the morning, not talking, just being there, in the way that people are there for each other when words have reached their limit. Before she left the next morning, she opened the cabinet in the hallway where her father kept the Remington and looked at it for a long time. Then she closed the cabinet and walked away. She did not touch a rifle for 2 years. She enlisted in the Navy in 2003. Not because she had forgotten how to shoot, because she had made a promise to her mother, quiet, unspoken, the kind of promise that doesn't need to be said out loud to carry the full weight of law, that she would go back to the work of keeping people alive and leave the other part of herself locked in that cabinet. She trained as a Navy corpsman. She was exceptional at it. She had the hands for it, steady, precise, immune to the kind of hesitation that gets people killed in the field. She completed the Special Operations Combat Medic course at Fort Sam Houston in Texas and graduated at the top of her class. Her instructors wrote things like unusually calm under pressure and clinical instincts beyond her experience level in her evaluations. Nobody wrote down what they sometimes noticed, that she looked at tactical situations the way a chess player looks at a board, rather than the way a support specialist looks at a problem. Nobody asked her about the 3 words carved into the bottom of the Remington she kept in the back of her closet. She kept her promise for 6 years. Then they sent her to Afghanistan. Bagram Airfield does not look like a place where anything important happens. It looks like a logistics hub that has been added to without a plan, prefabricated buildings in rows that almost make sense, blast barriers stacked along every perimeter, and vehicles in various states of use and disuse parked at angles that suggest urgency rather than order. The mountains in the distance are beautiful in the indifferent way that places are beautiful when they don't care whether you notice. The air at 4,900 feet has a thinness to it that you don't feel as altitude sickness. You feel it as a low, constant awareness that your body is working slightly harder than it should have to. Sloan arrived on a cargo flight in the first week of April 2009 with a duffel bag, a medical kit, and orders assigning her as support personnel to SEAL Team 3's Eastern Afghanistan rotation. She was 26 years old. She was the lowest-ranking person attached to the unit. The team assembled in a briefing room that smelled like old coffee and insulation foam. 4 men stood or sat in various attitudes of practiced relaxation, the kind that looks casual and is not. Lieutenant Commander Garrett Voss was at the head of the room, 47 years old, with the build of a man who had always been lean and had stayed that way through discipline rather than genetics. His face had the particular quality of someone who had spent a long time making decisions in bad situations, not hardened exactly, but refined the way a tool is refined when it has been used for its intended purpose long enough. He looked at Sloan's file when she came in. He looked at it longer than a first read required. Senior Chief Decker Rains was the first one to speak. He was a large man, the kind of large that isn't just about size, but about the space a person occupies, the way he moved and stood and held his own weight. 14 years of service, 2 Bronze Stars. He had the particular confidence of a man who had been right often enough to trust his first impressions, and his first impression of Sloan Harker was written plainly on his face before he opened his mouth. He looked at her the way men sometimes look at something that has shown up in the wrong place, not with malice, but with the flat, evaluating look of someone running a quick cost-benefit analysis. "You're the new medic," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Senior Chief." He picked up her paperwork, looked at it for 3 seconds, and set it back down. "Last thing we need out here is a babysitter job." Sloan did not change her expression. She did not adjust her posture. She looked at him with the same level of attention she had given Voss and said, "What's your blood type, Senior Chief?" Rains blinked. "I'm usually positive. Wow, good to know." She said nothing else. She turned to find a seat. Chief Cullen Shaw was the quietest person in the room, which was saying something because Voss himself was not a talkative man. Shaw was the team's primary shooter, tall, narrow-shouldered, with the kind of stillness that very good snipers develop over time, a physical discipline that begins as training and eventually becomes personality. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms crossed, and he did not offer an opinion when Rains made his comment, and he did not smile when the Sloan answered it. He watched. That was what he did. He watched, and he filed what he saw, and you could not tell from his face what conclusions he was drawing. Ward McCreary, who went by Pilgrim, a nickname acquired during a training exercise in 2004, whose origin he would describe differently depending on his audience, was the team's ordnance specialist. He was from a small town in eastern Oklahoma, and he had the open-faced quality of someone who grew up somewhere that still expected people to introduce themselves properly. He was the only member of the team who extended his hand when Sloan sat down. "Good to have you, Doc," he said. She shook it. "I'm not Doc yet." He grinned. "You will be." The briefing was routine. Standard operating procedures for the rotation communication protocols. A summary of current intelligence on Taliban movement patterns in the eastern provinces. Sloan listened and took no notes, which was not because she was not paying attention. She had a memory for information delivered verbally that she had noticed in herself as a child and had never seen a reason to explain to anyone. At one point during the briefing, Rains set his M4 down on the table to reach for a map. Sloan's right hand moved. A small movement, almost nothing. The tips of her fingers lifted slightly and then settled back into her lap as if responding to a signal that hadn't been sent. As if some deep practice part of her had begun a motion that the rest of her stopped before it went any further. Shaw saw it. He didn't say anything. He just shifted his weight slightly against the wall and noted it the way he noted everything quietly and for later. The mission was classified as ISR, Intelligence Surveillance Reconnaissance. 3 days into the mountains east of Bagram, in a valley system that ran along the Kunar River drainage toward the Pakistani border. Their objective was a Taliban logistics network that had been moving equipment through the high passes since the previous autumn. The orders were specific: observe, record, report. Do not engage unless directly threatened. It was by the standards of what SEAL Team 3 was capable of straightforward work. The first 20 minutes of any movement in that terrain required a recalibration that people who hadn't done it couldn't fully appreciate. The ground was not just uneven, it was actively hostile to the mechanics of forward progress, rocky and steep, in a way that turned every step into a small negotiation between the body and gravity. The altitude made the lungs work harder. The temperature, even in April, dropped sharply in the shade of the valley walls. By the time they had been moving for 2 hours, Sloan had made 3 observations about the men around her that she kept to herself. The first was that Voss moved like a man who was doing this for the last time and intended to do it correctly. There was a precision to his decision-making in the field, every choice about pace, route, positioning that came from experience, but also from something quieter, something that looked more like purpose than routine. The second was that Rains was as good as his reputation suggested. His competence was structural, built into the way he held his weapon and read the ground and positioned himself relative to the rest of the team. Sloan did not like him, but she respected what she was looking at. The third was that Shaw had been watching her since they left the wire. Not with suspicion. With the same careful, patient attention, he gave everything like a man taking a very long reading on conditions before committing to a shot. She filed that observation under relevant and moved on. On the morning of the second day, Ward McCreary sat down against a rock outcropping during a rest period and said nothing about the headache that had been building behind his eyes since 0600. Sloan noticed the way he was holding his head slightly forward, chin tilted down, and the particular way he was breathing through his nose, which was not his normal pattern. She moved to him without being asked, crouched at his level, and conducted a 30-second assessment that looked to anyone watching like casual conversation. "How long?" she said quietly. "Since this morning. It's nothing." "It's altitude. How much water have you had today?" He thought about it. "Not enough. Your headache is going to become a balance problem in about 4 hours if you don't address it now. Drink this." She handed him a hydration supplement from her kit. All of it. He drank it. An hour and 40 minutes later, during the next movement, he touched her arm briefly and nodded once. She nodded back. He didn't say anything about it for the rest of the day. But she caught him looking at her differently than he had before. Not with the evaluating skepticism of the first 24 hours, with something closer to attention. Rains, who had observed the exchange, said nothing. But later that evening, he developed a low-grade fever he attributed to cold exposure and addressed himself with ibuprofen. In the morning, it was still there. Sloan found him during the early light before the rest of the team was fully awake and handed him a packet of antibiotics without ceremony. "Left inner calf," she said. There's an abrasion that got contaminated sometime in the last 36 hours. Small, easy to miss. He looked at her, then down at his leg, then back at her. If you don't treat it now, it becomes a problem by day 3. He took the antibiotics. He did not say thank you. But for the rest of that morning, his comments about the new medic, which had been consistent and unrequested since her arrival, were notably absent. That evening, from a position on a ridgeline above a valley floor that the intelligence reports described as a primary transit corridor, Sloan was on second watch when she picked up movement to the southeast. 14 individuals moving in a file formation along a route that ran parallel to the valley floor rather than through it. They were traveling at a pace that suggested they knew the terrain and were comfortable in it. Their route had been designed consciously or from long habit to avoid the observation points that the briefing materials had identified as the most likely American positions. She watched for 38 minutes. She logged the direction, speed, formation, and equipment loadout. Then she went to wake Voss. He came back with her to the observation point, and she talked him through what she had seen, not excitedly, but with the flat sequential precision of a briefing. "They're not using the valley floor," she said. "The briefing materials identified 3 transit routes. 2 of them intersect the valley floor. The third runs east of the ridge. They're on the east road." "Third route wasn't flagged as high probability," Voss said. "No, sir, it wasn't." She paused. "They knew which routes were flagged." Voss was quiet for a moment. He looked through the scope at the empty ground where the figures had been. Then he looked at her, a look that lasted slightly longer than necessary, the kind that means reassessment is in progress. "Good eyes, Harker," he said. 2 words, delivered in the same tone he used for everything. But in the 18 hours since she had arrived on his team, it was the first time he had addressed her by name rather than rank. She filed that away too. On the third day, 30 minutes before the team was due to begin the return movement to their extraction point, Sloan was breaking down her kit when she heard voices below the ridgeline. Close voices, moving fast. The ambush was not sophisticated. 3 shooters positioned along the lower slope with lines of fire that covered the eastern approach. What they lacked in complexity, they made up for in timing. They had waited until the team was in the transition from static observation to active movement, the 30-second window, when every operator's attention is divided between what he's packing and what he's moving toward. What happened in the next 4 minutes was violent and loud and very fast. Sloan grabbed McCreary by the drag handle on the back of his plate carrier and pulled him sideways and down behind a rock formation that she had identified 20 minutes earlier as the best cover on that section of ridgeline. The movement was not tentative. It had the quality of something rehearsed low, fast committed, ending with both of them below the sight line of the shooters before the second burst of fire came in. McCreary looked at her. "Where'd you learn to move like that?" he said. She was already scanning the ridgeline above them, mapping the sound of the 3 shooters, tracking their positions from the pattern of their fire. She did not answer. The engagement lasted 4 minutes and ended with the ambush broken. The shooters withdrew rather than pressed, which suggested they had been positioned to harass and delay rather than to destroy. No casualties. Sloan treated a fragment wound on Shaw's forearm that was superficial enough to clean and dress in the field, which she did without stopping the after-action conversation happening around her. When they were moving again, heading back toward the extraction point, in the particular silence that follows a firefight, Rains fell into step beside her for 100 yards without saying anything. Then, "You pulled McCreary before the second burst came in." "Yes." "How did you know a second burst was coming?" "The first one was short. Short first burst means a nervous shooter. Nervous shooters double tap." Another 100 yards of silence. "Where did you learn that?" She walked for 3 more steps before she answered. "My father." She didn't offer anything else. And after a moment, Rains fell back to his own position in the formation without pressing it further. Shaw, 10 yards ahead, did not turn around. But the angle of his head changed slightly, the particular adjustment of a man who has just heard something he was already half expecting. That night, in a forward position while the rest of the team slept in rotation, Voss stepped outside the perimeter to make a call on an encrypted satellite line. The connection clicked through 3 relays before it resolved. "She's operational," Voss said. His voice was low with the particular flatness of a man delivering a report rather than having a conversation. "Exactly as briefed." A pause on the other end. "Does she know yet?" Voss looked back toward the position. Through the opening in the rock wall, he could see the outline of Sloan's jacket still controlled the same posture she had held through the entire 3-day movement. "No," he said, "she doesn't. Keep it that way until we need her to." Voss ended the call. He stood in the dark for a moment, looking at the mountains, at the high black lines of the ridges against the sky full of more stars than most people ever see in their lifetimes. Then he went back inside. Sloan Harker was not just a medic. She never had been. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that this mission had been assembled around her before she had signed a single piece of paperwork. That the men who had dismissed her on day one were part of a picture she had not yet been given the frame for. And that somewhere in these mountains, there was a man who knew exactly who her father was, what had happened to him, and why Sloan Harker, specifically only Sloan, had been put on a cargo plane and sent to this particular valley in this particular spring. The question wasn't whether she was good enough. She was already past that. The question was what she would do when she found out the truth. And that answer was coming faster than anyone in that valley was prepared for. They came back from the Kunar Valley the way operators always come back from 3 days in the mountains, quieter than when they left, carrying things that don't fit in a duffel bag. The debrief at Bagram lasted 2 hours. Standard questions, standard answers, the procedural language of after-action reporting that turns 4 minutes of violence and 3 days of cold into a sequence of timestamps and grid coordinates. Sloan sat at the end of the table and gave her portion of the report with the same flat precision she brought to everything, and when it was over, she went back to her bunk and slept for 6 hours without moving. When she woke up, there was a message on her assigned communications terminal. Report to conference room C at 1800. No name attached to the order, no unit designation, just the time and the room. She had been in enough different corners of military bureaucracy to know that unsigned orders from anonymous rooms meant exactly one of two things. Either someone had made an administrative error or someone did not want a paper trail. She was at conference room C at 1755. Voss was already there. So were Rainshaw and McCreary. Nobody was talking. The particular quality of their silence suggested they had not been told what this was about either, which meant they were all running the same quiet calculations. The man who came in at 1800 exactly was not in uniform. He was somewhere in his early 50s, medium height, with the kind of unremarkable face that you would struggle to describe accurately an hour after seeing it. His clothes were civilian, a dark jacket, plain shirt, no tie. He carried a thin folder and set a coffee cup on the table with the casual ease of a man comfortable in rooms where other people were not comfortable. He did not introduce himself with a name. What he offered instead was a file number, a clearance level, and the information that his name was not relevant to the conversation they were about to have. Everyone in the room had dealt with CIA officers before. The recognition was not spoken, but it was immediate and unanimous. The man Holloway was the name Sloan would eventually use, though she never confirmed whether that was actually his name, opened his folder, and laid 3 photographs on the table. The photographs showed a man in his early 60s, silver-haired heavyset in the way of someone who had once been very fit and had allowed it to soften without entirely disappearing. In 2 of the photographs, he was outdoors in what looked like Central Asian terrain. In the third, he was at a table in what might have been a hotel restaurant, talking to a figure whose face was not visible. Holloway let them look for a moment. Viktor Vulkov, he said, former KGB transferred to SVR after the Soviet collapse, retired officially in 2004, currently operating as a private intelligence broker, which is a polite way of saying he sells what he knows to whoever can afford it. He tapped the third photograph. What he currently has to sell is a comprehensive map of American intelligence assets operating across Central Asia. Recruitment records, cover identities, infrastructure, the kind of documentation that if it reaches the wrong buyer ends careers at minimum and ends lives at maximum. The room was quiet. He's moving through Kunar province with a Taliban escort that is providing security in exchange for transit access. He has a meeting scheduled in 72 hours at a location we have identified. Holloway paused. The meeting is not going to happen. Rains leaned forward slightly. You want us to intercept and extract? No. The single syllable landed in the room and stayed there. Voss said quietly, terminate. The paperwork will follow, Holloway said. It always does. Sloan was looking at the photographs, specifically at the photograph of Vulkov at the table. The angle of his shoulders, the particular way his hands were positioned, the quality of attention he was paying to the person across from him. The attention of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. The attention of a man who had spent his career managing other people's secrets. She set the photograph face down on the table and no one noticed the movement, except Shaw. What none of them knew, what Holloway had not included in his briefing, because it was filed in a compartment that none of them had clearance to access, was that Viktor Volkov had spent 22 months in the late 1990s running a deep-cover American operative inside a Russian-connected network in Central Asia. The operative's designation in CIA files was Asset Harker 7. His name was Daniel Harker. He was 38 years old when he disappeared in the Tora Bora region of Afghanistan in October 2001. Vulkov had not given Daniel Harker up. That distinction mattered not to the mission, not to the paperwork that would follow, but to the shape of what was true. Vulkov had in fact attempted to warn his asset in the final days before everything came apart. The warning had not arrived in time. The reason it had not arrived in time was a question whose answer sat in a file that Garrett Voss had been trying to access through unofficial channels for 8 years. None of this was in Holloway's briefing. Sloan drove back to her bunk that evening and lay on her back and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The photograph of her father was in the inside pocket of her jacket where she kept it. She did not take it out. She did not need to. She had the image memorized down to the particular quality of his smile, wide, unguarded, the smile of a man who knew exactly what he had in his life and was grateful for it. She thought about the photograph of Vulkov at the table. She thought about the word handler, which had appeared once in a document she had read 3 years ago at Fort Sam Houston in a file she had not been authorized to access and had accessed anyway in the 30 minutes between the end of her shift and the beginning of the next one, in the quiet hours when the administrative office was empty. The document had described her father's operational history in the kind of language designed to convey information without illuminating it. But one phrase had stayed with her, specific and clear. Last known handler contact, October 12, 2001. She had never been able to find the handler's name. The field had been redacted in every version of the document she could locate. She did not sleep much that night. In the morning, the team began preparation for the operation. The next 48 hours had the particular texture of work done by people who are very good at what they do and have stopped needing to discuss it. Equipment checks, communication protocols, a terrain analysis of the area surrounding Volkov's projected exchange point. Shaw recalibrated his scope twice, which was not because it needed it, but because Shaw recalibrated his scope before any operation of consequence, the way some people check the locks on their doors before sleeping. McCreary prepped 2 small breaching charges and walked Sloan through the contingency plan for creating an exit route through the building's south wall if the primary route was compromised. He was methodical and patient, and at the end of it, he looked at her and said, "You doing all right, Doc?" "Yes." "You've been quiet." "I'm usually quiet." He thought about that. Quieter than usual, then. She almost said something. The impulse moved through her briefly and then resolved into the longer habit of containment. "I'm fine. Good to go." He nodded. He did not press it. On the second evening, Sloan took a walk along the perimeter that was not random. She had been reviewing the SATCOM logs, a routine task that nobody had specifically assigned her, but that she had taken on because nobody else was doing it, and because information in those logs had a way of being relevant in situations where the stated intelligence picture was incomplete. What she found was not in the logs themselves. It was in the metadata. A transmission record from a personal device, not a unit-issued communicator, showing a short outgoing signal at 2140 hours 6 days prior during the final evening of the ISR rotation before anyone had been briefed on the Vulkov objective. The signal had lasted 11 seconds. It had been sent on a frequency that was not assigned to any member of the team. It was not encrypted with any cipher that the unit used. She looked at the device identifier for a long time. She knew who it belonged to. She had known since the first day when she had made the habit of noting the equipment each team member carried the same way she noted their blood types and the way they held their bodies under physical stress. Information collected without agenda, stored against the possibility of relevance. The frequency corresponded to a range she recognized from a signals intelligence summary she had read the previous year, a summary that described communication patterns used by networks operating in the Kunar corridor to coordinate around American movement. She sat with that information for a very long time. She did not report it that night. She did not report it the following morning. She filed it in the part of her mind where she kept the things she was not yet finished understanding, and she went back to her preparation, and she said nothing. Because reporting it ended the operation and produced a suspected man. And suspected men with 14 years of service and 2 Bronze Stars walked away. What she needed was not suspicion. What she needed was certainty delivered at the moment when there was no longer anywhere to walk. They moved out at 2200. The terrain on the approach to Volkov's exchange point required 4 hours of careful movement through a valley system that funneled wind down from the high passes in a way that changed the acoustic environment unpredictably. Shaw established his overwatch position on a ridgeline to the north, while the rest of the team moved into a holding pattern 400 meters from the target building, a low stone structure that had been used as a waypoint by traitors and fighters alike for decades, a building that had no particular allegiance to any cause and had survived by being useful to whoever needed it. Vulkov was inside, confirmed by thermal imaging 30 minutes before the team moved. 3 bodyguards with him tight formation, professional spacing. 4 armed men on the exterior perimeter, rotating in a pattern that suggested training. Everything was in position. And then at the 47th minute of the operation, something that was not in any plan happened. The shot came from a position on the eastern slope that none of the pre-mission surveillance had identified as occupied. It was a single round, not a burst, and it found Shaw with the particular efficiency of someone who knew exactly where the American Overwatch was going to be. The round caught him in the upper left shoulder and spun him off his position. He went down behind the ridgeline and stayed down. He was alive. His voice came through the communications channel 10 seconds later, controlled but tight. Overwatch is down, shoulder, I'm out. The information landed in Sloan's earpiece and registered in the specific way that critical information registers when you are already running multiple parallel calculations, not as surprise, but as a variable that required immediate integration. Without Overwatch, the ground element was operating blind on its flanks. Volkov's escort had numbers. The exchange point was approximately 40 seconds away on foot. If Vulkov reached the exchange and completed the transfer, the operational objective was gone. Voss's voice in her ear, calm, flat, carrying the weight of a decision being made in real time. Harker, can you take the shot? The distance was 760 yards. She had run the numbers in her head 20 minutes ago. Not because she had been planning for this, but because she ran numbers on sightlines automatically as a function of how her mind worked. The wind was coming off the northeast face at approximately 11 knots, which meant a correction of 7 to 8 inches left. The angle was slightly downhill, which meant a compensating adjustment to the distance calculation. The light was low but not absent. There was a partial moon. She did not answer immediately. She was already moving. She went to the pack she had carried for 3 days through mountains and 2 operations without anyone other than Shaw, noticing it was slightly heavier than a medical kit needed to be. She unzipped the lower compartment and began assembling the Macmillan TAC 338 with the movements of someone who has done something enough times that thought and action have merged into a single function. 55 seconds from the first component to a fully assembled and chambered rifle. Rains was watching her. McCreary was watching her. Voss had gone still in the particular way of a man who has stopped giving orders because the situation has moved past the point where orders are the relevant tool. She climbed to the elevated position above the team's hold point, a shelf of rock that added 12 feet of elevation and improved the sight line to the exchange point's approach corridor. She settled the bipod. She found Volkov's position through the scope. He was moving. One of his bodyguards had him by the arm, pulling him toward the building's side entrance. They were covering ground quickly. The bodyguard was positioned on Volkov's left side between the principal and the direction from which any American fire would logically come. She adjusted for the bodyguard's position. She adjusted for wind. She tracked the movement and calculated lead. She controlled her breathing through the 4 count her father had taught her in a field in North Carolina, 4 and hold for 7, release over 8. She fired. The shot was low and left. The wind had shifted in the 3 seconds between her final calculation and the moment of trigger. Break a change she felt in the instant the round left the barrel, too late to correct. The bullet struck the stone wall 18 inches from the doorframe. Volkov and his bodyguard both stopped. Instinct drove them down and behind a low wall rather than through the door. She worked the bolt. The spent case ejected into the dark behind her. She did not think about the miss. She adjusted for the wind correction, recalculated, controlled her breathing again, and waited for her heart rate to cross below the threshold where the body stops interfering with the work. Her father's voice in the field south of Fayetteville, "A bullet doesn't care how pretty you are. It only cares if you're patient." The bodyguard shifted his weight to look back over the wall. She fired. The bodyguard dropped. Volkov pressed himself flat against the base of the wall and stayed there, tactically correct and no longer moving toward the door. From the team's position 30 meters behind her, there was a silence that had a specific texture, the silence of experienced men processing something that has just changed the category they were using to understand a situation. She disassembled the rifle. She was back down to the team's level in 40 seconds. The components packed, the pack zipped. "We need to move," she said. "He won't stay down long." Nobody argued. On the approach to the building in the compressed quiet of tactical movement, Rains came up beside her for a stretch of ground. He said nothing for 30 meters. Then in the low, controlled voice of a man choosing his words deliberately, "Where did you learn that?" She kept her pace, kept her eyes on the ground ahead. "My father." Nothing else. And Rains, who had spent 3 days cataloging what he assumed about her and had just watched every one of those assumptions be replaced by evidence, said nothing more. What happened in the next 6 minutes was not in any plan. In the controlled sequence of securing the building's perimeter and managing the remaining exterior guards, Sloan was moving along the south wall when she saw Rains step away from the formation. 20 feet around the corner of a low outbuilding and into a shadow that the team's night vision could not fully penetrate. She did not follow immediately. She noted the direction, noted the time, and continued her assigned movement for 30 more seconds. Then she changed her route. She was close enough to see without being seen. Rains had his back to her. His hand was raised to his ear, not his team radio, a personal device. His posture had changed. The particular confidence he carried in operational environments, which was still there in his shoulders, but below it, in the set of his spine and the way his weight was distributed, there was something that looked like a man managing something heavy for the last time. He spoke for 9 seconds. She could not hear the words. She did not need to. The device in his hand and the frequency she had identified in the SATCOM metadata 6 days ago had already given her the relevant information. She had been waiting for confirmation. Confirmation had arrived. She went back to her position. They secured the building. Vulkov was found behind the low wall uninjured, in the condition of a man who had lived through enough professional violence to know that stillness was the correct response to a situation he could not control. He looked at each member of the team in turn when they brought him inside, and when his eyes reached Sloan, they stopped for a moment longer than they had stopped on anyone else. She did not acknowledge it. Voss was establishing the communication link to Holloway when Rains stepped back into the building and moved to a position near the doorway, standard perimeter maintenance, nothing that would draw attention. Sloan moved to the SATCOM pack and pulled up the frequency scanner. She found the signal in 11 seconds. Rains's personal device had transmitted again 20 seconds ago on the same frequency as the recording from 6 days prior. She stood up and walked to the doorway. "Senior Chief?" Her voice was the same voice she had used every day for the past 3 days, low, flat, carrying without effort. Rains turned. She held up the frequency scanner so he could see the display. The moment lasted about 3 seconds. She watched his face move through several things quickly. Then it settled into the expression of a man who has been running something for a long time and has just been told the running is over. "You saw the signal?" he said, not a question. "6 days ago," she said, "before we left the wire, and 20 seconds ago." His right hand moved toward his hip. The shot came from outside. A single round entered through the doorframe's left edge and destroyed the personal device in Rains's hand without touching his skin. He stepped back from the shock of it, and his hand opened reflexively around the pieces of what had been in it. Shaw. From his position on the ridgeline, immobilized by a shoulder wound, but not incapacitated with a line of sight he had apparently been maintaining through a scope while the rest of the team worked. His voice came through the communications channel with the same characteristic flatness as if he were reporting Heather. "Device neutralized." Rains looked at the pieces on the ground, then at Sloan, then at Voss, who had turned from the communication setup and was watching with the expression of a man whose calculations had just been confirmed. Rains did not reach for his weapon. "I need to go," he said. "No," Voss said. McCreary moved to Rains's position without being asked, and Rains did not resist, and the room rearranged itself around that new fact. Voss waited until the situation had stabilized into something that could hold a conversation. Then he crossed the room to where Sloan was standing and reached into the interior pocket of his plate carrier. He removed a brown envelope, standard size, no markings. The corners were soft, the seal carrying the wear of something that has been handled and replaced and handled again many times over. He held it for a moment before he gave it to her. "I've been carrying this for 8 months, he said. His voice had dropped to the register he used when a situation was no longer operational and had become something else. "I was told to give it to you if the mission went sideways." He placed it in her hands. "I should have told you sooner," he said. "That's on me." She looked at the envelope. She looked at him. His face told her nothing about what was inside, but the way he had said that last sentence told her everything about the weight of it. She opened it. Inside was a single document, a photocopied excerpt from a CIA internal review, dated November 2001. Several lines were redacted. The unredacted portions were written in the flat, precise language of institutional record-keeping. She read it once. Her eyes moved through it at a steady pace. She reached the last unredacted line. She read it again. Asset Harker 7, Daniel J. Harker, MSG, U.S. A operational compromise confirmed. Exfiltration failure, October 14th, 2001, Tora Bora region. Cause internal communication breach. Source identification. See supplemental file. Preliminary contact established. Rains DK, 1999. Below the typed text and handwriting that was not part of the official document, ink, slightly different pressure, slightly heavier, were 4 more words. I tried to warn him. She stood with the document in her hands for 12 seconds. She did not move. She did not make a sound. The quality of her stillness was not the stillness of shock. It was the stillness of someone in whom a very long question has just received its answer and who is taking the time to understand what comes next. 12 seconds. Then she folded the document back into the envelope, handed it to Voss, and said, "Where's Vulkov now?" Voss said, "He's secure in the far room, and the exchange point is still active. For the next 2 hours. After that, his contact disappears." She picked up her medical kit from the ground and slung it over her shoulder. She checked the magazine on her sidearm with a movement that was automatic and complete. She looked at the door. "Then we need to move," she said. Voss was quiet for a moment. Behind him, McCreary was watching her. Volkov in the far room had gone still. "Sloan," Voss said. She paused. "Your father was my friend," he said. She stood with her back to him for 2 seconds. Her shoulders did not change. Her posture did not change. The only thing that changed was something in the quality of the air between them, something that required no acknowledgement to be real. "I know," she said. Then she walked to the door and she went out into the dark, and she did not wait to see if anyone was following. She already knew they would be. They always followed the person who knew where they were going. The dark in Kunar province is not like dark in other places. It has a physical weight to it, a density that presses against the edges of your night vision and reminds you that the absence of light out here is not inconvenience, it is condition. The mountains hold the cold the way old buildings hold old smells deep in the stone, unmoved by whatever passes through. The wind comes down from the high passes in irregular intervals, and between those intervals there is a silence so complete that you can hear your own blood moving. Sloan moved through it the way she moved through everything, without announcing herself, without requiring acknowledgement, reading the ground under her boots and the air against her face with the accumulated attention of someone who had been paying this kind of attention for a very long time. Behind her, 3 men followed at the spacing she had set without discussing it, Voss on her left shoulder, 10 meters back. McCreary on the right, carrying his ordnance pack with the particular efficiency of a large man who has learned to make his size work for him rather than against him in confined terrain. Shaw compromised, but mobile, moving with his left arm stabilized against his chest by a field dressing that Sloan had applied in 40 seconds between the first building and the tree line, had taken a position that covered their 6. Rains was ahead of them, somewhere in the dark. She knew his pace. She knew the length of his stride, the way he placed his weight on the outside of his left foot when he was moving fast on uneven ground, a compensation for an old ankle injury she had identified in his gait on the second day and filed without comment. She knew how he thought about terrain, having watched him navigate the same valley system 3 days earlier. She could not see him, but she could calculate him, and the calculation told her that if he was moving to reach Volkov's exchange point and warn his contact, he was using the most direct route available, which meant he was not using the route she was using. There was a draw on the north side of the valley, a narrow cut in the rock that ran at an angle to the primary approach corridor, too tight for a full tactical element, barely passable for 2 people moving single file. She had found it on the satellite imagery during the pre-mission terrain analysis, noted it without flagging it to anyone, and added it to the private map she maintained of every environment she operated in. Not because she had known she would need it, because knowing things cost nothing, and not knowing them sometimes cost everything. The draw cut 8 minutes off the approach. 8 minutes was the difference between Rains reaching the exchange point and Rains not reaching it. She went through the cut first, and the rock closed around her from both sides close enough to feel, and she moved through it with her shoulders angled and her breathing controlled and her mind ahead of her body, the way her father had taught her, not running to the next thing, but already there, already understanding it, so that when the body arrived, the mind was waiting. The exchange point came into sight from the high end of the draw as they emerged onto a shelf of rock that looked down on the structure from the west. The building below was squat and old, built from the same stone as everything else in this part of the world, as if the mountains had simply decided to arrange themselves into something useful. 3 windows, 2 exterior doors, 4 armed men on the perimeter moving in the rotation pattern that intelligence had identified. Rains was 60 meters out, approaching from the south, still moving, still outside. Sloan held up her fist and the movement behind her stopped. She had 90 seconds to work with before Rains reached the building's south entrance. She spent 20 of them reading the structure, the perimeter, the angles of approach, and the shadows that would determine what was visible and what was not. She spent the remaining 70 speaking in a voice low enough that it barely qualified as sound. Shaw would take the elevated position on the shelf. His left arm was compromised, but his right hand worked, and at the distances involved his right hand was sufficient. He would manage the exterior perimeter and create the distraction that everything else depended on. McCreary would place a small breaching charge on the structure's east-facing outbuilding wall, not to destroy it, only to produce a sound and a flash significant enough to pull attention to the wrong direction for approximately 4 seconds. Voss would come through the main entrance from the north at the moment of the breach. Sloan would enter from the south. She did not explain why she was taking the south entrance. She did not need to. The south entrance was the one through which Rains was about to arrive, which meant it was the entrance that needed to be occupied by someone who understood exactly what that variable introduced into the situation. Voss looked at her for a moment in the way he had been looking at her since the brown envelope. A look that contained several things at once, assessment and trust and something older than either. Then he moved. McCreary touched her arm before he went. Not a word, just the brief, specific pressure of someone communicating something that words would have made smaller. She moved to the south approach and waited. The wait was 90 seconds. In operational time, 90 seconds is long enough to run every scenario and short enough that only the relevant ones survive. She identified 2 positions of cover within her field of view, ranked them by protection versus sight lines, and chose the one that gave her a clear view of the south entrance without requiring her to be visible to Rains until she chose to be. She heard his footsteps at 60 meters. She recognized the gate. At 20 meters, he stopped, entirely listening, the way operators listen when they sense something has changed in the environment, but cannot yet identify what. Then the charge on the east wall detonated. The sound was sharp and brief, more pressure than noise, and the flash lit the eastern face of the building, white for a fraction of a second. Every man on the exterior perimeter reacted in the direction of the sound. From inside the building came a shout, followed by movement. Rains broke toward the south entrance. He came through the door fast, expecting an empty room, and what he found instead was Sloan Harker, 2 meters inside the threshold with her sidearm leveled at center mass. He stopped. The sounds of the building being cleared came from the far room's fast-controlled alarm. The sounds of men who know what they are doing. The sounds got closer and then resolved into Voss coming through the interior doorway, McCreary behind him, and the building's remaining occupants being managed with the economical efficiency that SEAL Team 3 had spent years developing. Rains looked at the gun in Sloan's hand. He looked at her face. He was breathing hard from the approach run, and beneath the operational surface of him, there was something that looked like a man who has been carrying something for a very long time and has finally arrived at the place where he sets it down. He did not reach for his weapon. "I knew," she said. The 2 words sat in the room. 6 days ago, she said. "Before we left the wire, the frequency in the SATCOM logs, I ran the device identifier against the unit manifest, and I knew." She did not lower the weapon. Her voice was the same voice she used for everything level without display. "I didn't report it." He looked at her. "Why, Quan?" "Because reporting it ended the operation. Not reporting it ended you." Voss moved to a position that covered Rains from the other side, and McCreary came through the door from the south, and Rains looked around the room with the expression of a man understanding the architecture of something he has only just fully seen. "The whole time," he said, not accusing, just the flat recognition of it. "The whole time," she said. She lowered the weapon but did not holster it. She held it at her side and looked at him with an attention that was not anger. It was something more complete than anger, the full, clear gaze of someone who has carried a question for a very long time and is finally standing in front of the answer. "My father's name was Daniel Harker," she said. "He died in October 2001 because someone told the wrong people where he was going to be. I read the file 3 years ago. The source field was redacted, but the file referenced a preliminary contact date, 1999, which is the year you were assigned to the same SOCOM advisory rotation that my father's handler network ran through." Rains said nothing. "I did the rest myself," she said. "It took 2 years." The room was very quiet. Rains sat down on the floor, not because he was told to, because whatever had been holding him upright for the past 10 years had finally run out of the thing that was holding it. "They had leverage," he said. His voice was not the voice he used in briefings or in the field. It was the voice of something underneath all of those things, older, more tired, rubbed to the texture of something that has been carried in a pocket for too long. In 1999, something I had done before I knew better, they said if I didn't feed them information, just small stuff, at first it would come out. And the small stuff turned into bigger stuff. And then one day they asked for something I knew would get someone killed, and I told myself it was an asset, not a person. His name was Daniel Harker, Sloan said. Not louder, the same voice, but the repetition of it in that room in that moment had a weight that volume could not have added. He was 38 years old. He had a daughter who grew up without him. Rains looked at his hands. Then Voss said quietly, in the far room. Sloan looked up. Victor Vulkov was brought through the interior doorway. He was uninjured and composed with the bearing of a man accustomed to being the most informed person in any room, even when the room was controlled by people who had come to kill him. He took in the scene without expression. He looked at Voss, at Rains on the floor, at McCreary by the door. Then his eyes found the Sloan and stopped. He looked at her the way people sometimes look at photographs of people they used to know, with the specific quality of recognition that comes not from the face itself, but from something within it, something structural and old. You have his eyes, he said. His English was precise with the cadence of someone who learned it from documents rather than conversation. The same winter color. Daniel's eyes. Sit down, Sloan said. He sat. What Victor Volkov said in the next 12 minutes was not the statement of a man trying to negotiate his survival. It was the statement of a man who had been carrying something for 8 years and had arrived at the point where carrying it had become more costly than releasing it. He had run Daniel Harker as an asset for 22 months. He said this the way a man says something he is not ashamed of, not proudly, but with the directness of a fact that does not require qualification. Daniel had been exceptional. He had the combination of intelligence and patience that made for a genuinely effective deep cover operative, and he had the character, Volkov used that word deliberately, character, to do the work without losing himself in it. In September 2001, Volkov had detected anomalies in the communication patterns surrounding Daniel's operational network. The anomalies pointed to a compromise. He had attempted to send a warning through the back channel they used for exactly this contingency. The warning had not arrived. I learned later why, he said. The communication channel was monitored. The monitor was inside, not on my side. He paused. Someone in your country's structure had decided that Daniel Cross knew too much about a program they wanted buried. Rains was the mechanism, the hand on the lever. The decision came from higher. He looked at Sloan. He knew at the end that the warning hadn't come through. I believe he understood the shape of it. That is the kind of man he was. He stopped. He would have been thinking about you. At the end, that is also the kind of man he was. The room absorbed that sentence the way a heavy stone absorbs water, slowly, completely, in a way that changes what it is. Sloan was looking at a point on the wall to the left of Volkov's head. Her face was still. Her jaw was set with the same locked precision it had carried since the brown envelope, the same way it had been set on the drive back from Raleigh in October 2001, when she was 18 years old and the world had reorganized itself around an absence. Then from McCreary's position near the door, a short, sharp intake of breath that was not a sound he would have made if he had been given a choice about it. Sloan was across the room before the sound finished. He had been hit during the breach, a fact he had not reported because the operation was still active and because he was from eastern Oklahoma, and that was not how he was built. The round had caught him in the upper thigh, and the blood soaking through the lower left leg of his tactical pants had finally crossed the threshold he had been using to decide it was not worth mentioning. She assessed in the first 4 seconds. Femoral region, high lateral thigh entry, and exit both present. The exit wound was the concern, larger, more complex, already losing volume at a rate that had a specific timeline attached to it. Femoral branch involvement, she said. Her voice had not changed in register, but had changed in focus, narrowed to a single clear frequency, the voice she used when the work required everything else to be quiet. Tourniquet now, or we lose him in 90 seconds. She had the cat tourniquet applied and tightened in 11 seconds. She had the wound packed with combat gauze in 22 seconds, after that applying direct pressure with both hands leaning into it with her full weight. McCreary looked down at her hands working on his leg, then at her face. You good, she said. You're asking me, I'm asking you. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but came from the same place a laugh comes from. Yeah, he said, I'm good, Doc. She held the pressure. She held it for 4 minutes, counting her own heartbeats to track the time, which was something her father had taught her and which she had never stopped doing. At the 144th beat, she checked the dressing and confirmed the loss rate had dropped to manageable. The helicopter was audible now. 10 minutes out, maybe 12. The sound came in pulses over the mountains, carried and then cut by the wind. Voss had not moved from the position he had taken when she began working on McCreary. He stood 6 feet away, and in the time that had passed since she had knelt down, he had been entirely still. Not the stillness of inattention, but the stillness of a man watching something he intends to remember. Watching not with the operational assessment of a commanding officer evaluating a subordinate, but with the complete attention of a person witnessing something that is going to matter to him for the rest of his life. He reached into the interior pocket of his plate carrier. He removed a small object wrapped in a square of green cloth that had been folded and refolded many times the way things are wrapped when they have been carried for a long time, and the wrapping has become part of the object. He held it in both hands for a moment. Then he crossed to her and crouched down to her level and placed it in her right hand, the hand that was not maintaining pressure on the dressing. "Open it," he said. She shifted her left hand to maintain pressure alone and used her right to unwrap the cloth. One layer, then another, and then the metal was in her palm, simple, unadorned, heavier than it looked. She turned it over. She read the 7 words engraved on the reverse in letters small enough that you had to hold it close. For the ones who never got to know. McCreary looked up at her from the floor. He saw what was in her hand. He looked at her face. He said nothing. He turned his eyes back to the ceiling and breathed carefully and left the room to the people who needed it. In the corner, Shaw stood with his damaged shoulder held against his chest, watching. Across the space, Raines sat on the floor with his hands open in his lap. "There was a ceremony," Voss said. His voice had dropped to almost nothing. "It never happened officially. No record, no location, no date you could find in any file. 20 men stood at attention in a room without windows, and a name was read aloud. Just the name, nothing else. That was everything they could give him." He paused. "I was one of the 20. I've been holding that medal since I walked out of the room. I told myself I was holding it until I found the truth. I found enough of the truth tonight to know it's past time." She held the medal. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. They had been steady through 2 firefights, in a trauma dressing, and an extraction, and a conversation that covered 8 years of absence, and a full operation that she had been running in parallel with the one everyone else thought was the only one. They had been steady through everything this night had asked them to be steady for. Until now. Not a tremor, not a visible shake, but something in the musculature of them, something very deep that had been held at a certain tension for a very long time and was releasing. Garrett Voss straightened to his full height. He was standing on a dirt floor in Kunar Province, Afghanistan, with smoke still in the air and blood on the floor and a helicopter 9 minutes out. None of the conditions for ceremony were present. The building was not a ceremony room. The people in it were not dressed for one. There was no protocol that covered what was about to happen. He raised his right hand to the brim of his cover. Full salute. Not at rank. Not at record. Not at anything institutional or official or written down in any document that would survive the night. At the woman kneeling on the floor in front of him, both hands back on the dressing. Now the metal pressed between her right palm and the bandaging, doing the work that kept people alive, while simultaneously being the person who had earned the thing that nobody had thought to give her father, and who had arrived at this specific dart through 8 years of quiet, unrecorded, unpermissioned truth-finding, and who had spent the last 6 days running a parallel operation inside an operation that was designed around her without her knowledge, and who had delivered it all to this single point with the patience that her father had taught her in a field south of Fayetteville when she was 10 years old, and the world was still a place where Saturday mornings were for learning and not for grieving. 8 seconds, one for each year the truth had been buried. Sloan Harker did not stand. She stayed where she was kneeling, both hands maintaining the pressure that was keeping Ward McCreary's blood inside his body. She raised her eyes to Voss. She held his gaze for the full duration. Then she raised her free hands slowly, deliberately, precisely angled, and returned the salute, the way her grandfather had shown her in the backyard in Fayetteville when she was 6 years old, the way her father had corrected her elbow position when she was 8, the way she had practiced it without anyone watching for 20 years, because some things you maintain even when there is no occasion for them, because one day the occasion arrives. 8 seconds. They both lowered their hands. Neither of them spoke. Shaw, standing in the corner with his damaged shoulder, did not speak. McCreary, flat on his back with his eyes on the ceiling, said quietly into the silence, "She saved my life twice tonight. And I did not know about the first time until she told me." Nobody answered him, But outside, the helicopter was almost there. Fort Sam Houston, Texas, in early October has a quality to it that is hard to describe to people who haven't experienced it. The tail end of summer releasing its grip slowly and with reluctance, the mornings carrying the first real suggestion of something cooler in the way the air moves before dawn. The sky at midday goes a blue so deep and specific that it seems like it belongs to the season rather than the geography. Sloan arrived at the classroom building at 7:15, 45 minutes before the first students. She set up the materials on the tables with the systematic efficiency of someone who has done this enough times to have a system. When everything was in order, she stood at the window for a few minutes and looked at the parade ground where the early PT formations were moving in the gray light. The circles under her eyes had faded. She had put back the 6 pounds she had lost in the field, and her face had the particular quality that faces develop when a person has stopped carrying something they had been carrying for a long time, not emptied, but clarified the way a room looks after you have removed the furniture that was always in the wrong place. The Remington 700 was on the desk in her quarters back on base, not in the cabinet. On the desk cleaned and maintained where it had been every day for the past 4 months. She had taken it out the morning after she came home and set it where she could see it from the door, and she had not put it back. The medal was beside it. 16 students came through the door at 800. Mixed specialties, mixed experience levels, all of them assigned to a new curriculum that had no precedent in any existing program, a course that combined tactical combat casualty care with integrated field operations designed by someone who had learned in a stone building in a mountain province that the separation between those two disciplines was an administrative fiction that cost lives. She stood at the front of the room and looked at them for a moment. Then she turned to the whiteboard and wrote 7 words in letters large enough to read from the back. Heal when you can. Fight when you must. She turned back. My name is Harker, she said. You will use that name for the duration of this course, nothing else. We are going to spend the next 6 weeks making the distinction between those two sentences smaller than it is right now, and by the end of it, you are going to understand that the best field operator is not the one who does one thing perfectly. It is the one who does both things well enough that the situation never has to choose for you. She looked at them. They looked back at her with the particular combination of attention and uncertainty that characterizes people standing at the beginning of something they don't yet have language for. Questions at the end, she said. Let's start. The curriculum she had designed would eventually be requested for development by the Veterans Administration across 4 states. The process would take 14 months and involve more meetings than she had patience for, and produce a document that was by necessity a simplified version of what she actually taught. What she actually taught could not be fully reduced to a document. It lived in the gap between what the document described and what the room contained when the right teacher was standing in it. A phrase had begun to move through the special operations community, carried by the informal networks that transmit information below the level of official communication passed from one person to another, in the way that useful things travel, when the institution hasn't yet figured out what category to put them in. Drag them out alive. Nobody tracked the exact origin. It appeared in after-action summaries and training evaluations, and the particular oral tradition of units that passed their real knowledge mouth to ear rather than page to eye. If you followed the chain back far enough, and some people had tried it, led eventually to a name in a classified operational file and a stone building in Kunar province that did not appear in any official record. Ward McCreary recovered and returned to duty 5 months after surgical repair at Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, told the story once to a new team member who asked about the scar on his thigh. He described it in 12 sentences. The last one was, "She saved my life twice that night, and I didn't know about the first time until she told me." Cullen Shaw put in a formal recommendation for Sloan's curriculum development 3 weeks after returning to the continental United States. The recommendation included an operational summary, classified at a level high enough that only 14 people in the relevant chain of command ever read it. Those 14 people subsequently made decisions about training development that they attributed to various institutional factors, the way people in institutions attribute things when they don't want to trace the thread back to where it actually starts. Garrett Voss retired from active duty 14 months after Kunar province. On the day of his retirement ceremony, he stood in the sun on a parade ground in Virginia and received handshakes from men who knew parts of his story, and he thought about 8 seconds in a dark building in Afghanistan, and he was at peace with the shape of his service in a way that he had not been for a very long time. Decker Rains was processed through channels that exist specifically to process people like him, quietly, thoroughly, without the kind of public accounting that would require explanations the institution was not prepared to provide. What leverage had been used against him, and by whom, and in service of which buried program became part of an investigation that ran for 2 years. Whether it produced accountability was a question that depended on how you define the word, which was itself a question that the institution had been deferring for longer than Sloan had been alive. Victor Volkov's testimony became the cornerstone of that investigation. Daniel Harker's file was amended. A single line added to the existing record: status revised, circumstances updated, source documentation attached. Not declassified, not made public, not given the ceremony that had never been given to him while it was still possible. Amended. On a Tuesday evening in early October, Sloan sat in her quarters after the day's final session and picked up her phone. Her mother answered on the second ring with the voice of someone who has been waiting for a call without knowing she was waiting. They talked for 20 minutes about things that were not the important thing: the weather in Fayetteville, a neighbor's situation, the small practical details of life that create continuity between the people across distance. And then there was a pause in which both of them felt the other things sitting in the call. "Mom," Sloan said. "Yeah, baby." "I think Dad would have been okay with it." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Outside Sloan's window, the last light was draining out of the Texas sky in the specific orange that only happens for about 8 minutes and then is gone. "I know he would have," her mother said. "I've always known that. I should have told you I was going to do what I did before I did it." "You couldn't tell me," her mother said. "And you wouldn't have, because you're him, Sloan. You've always been him. And he never told me anything either until it was already done." She did not say it as a criticism. She said it as the fact of loving someone who was what they were, the particular piece of having stopped wanting a person to be different from what they were. "He would have been proud," her mother said. "He already was. You just never stopped being someone to be proud of." Sloan sat with that for a moment. "Okay," she said. "Good night, Mom." "Good night, baby." She set the phone down and looked at the desk. The Remington and the medal and the photograph of her father, all three of them there in the light from the window in the last of the Texas evening. She thought about a field south of Fayetteville and a Saturday morning and a patient voice telling her that a bullet doesn't care how pretty you are. It only cares if you're a patient. She thought about the 8 seconds. She thought about the weight of the medal in her hand on a dirt floor in the dark, and the way Voss had held the salute for the full duration, and the way she had returned it without standing up from the work she was doing, because the work was what the moment was about. Not the recognition of it, not the ceremony of it, but the fact that both hands had been in use when it happened, one holding a life in, and one accepting what had been owed for 8 years. The phone on the desk rang. Washington, D.C. area code. She looked at it for 3 seconds. Then she picked it up. "Harker." Holloway's voice on the other end, flat and functional, stripped of everything that wasn't information. "We have a situation developing in—" "Send me the file," she said. "I'll call you back in an hour." She ended the call. She set the phone down beside the medal and the rifle and the photograph. She looked out the window at the sky, making its final transition from orange to the deep blue-black that comes before full dark, and the first stars becoming visible in the way stars do when they have been there all along, and you simply have not had enough darkness to see them yet. She reached for the file. There are things that happen in the space between official records in the dirt and the dark, and the moments that no after-action report was designed to capture that are more true than anything the documents contain. The forms ask for coordinates and timestamps and casualty figures. They do not ask what it costs a person to become fully themselves under conditions designed to prevent it. They do not ask what patience looks like when it has been held for 8 years. They do not ask about a salute given on a battlefield floor while both hands were occupied with keeping someone alive. What happened in Kunar province in April of 2009 is not in any file you could access. The building doesn't appear on any map of significance. The operation has no official name. The medal that changed hands that night is not registered in any system. But 20 men once stood at attention in a room without windows and read a name aloud. One of them carried what came next for 8 years and delivered it on a dirt floor to the person it was always meant for. Some debts don't appear on any ledger. They travel in the pockets of people who refuse to forget them, passed hand to hand across the years until they find their way home. That one found its way home 8 years late, which in the end is the only kind of on time that matters. Sloan Harker read the file. She set it down. She picked up the phone. She was always working. That was who she was. That was who her father raised her to be.